My father-in-law called me a glorified errand girl at my own baby shower. He said it with a smile, the kind that makes everyone in the room laugh and makes you feel like the problem is that you can't take a joke. 200 people watched me absorb it. My husband's hand found mine under the table and I felt his fingers squeeze once, twice. I squeezed back. Not yet. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the patent sitting in the FDA's approval queue, the one that had been generating quiet buzz in biotech circles for 3 months, had my name on it, not his son's. Mine. And in 48 hours, the New England Journal of Medicine was going to make that very clear to everyone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house where the heat sometimes cut out in January, and my mother worked double shifts at a dialysis clinic to keep the lights on. She had a nursing degree and the kind of quiet competence that made her irreplaceable at work and invisible everywhere else. She never complained. She just showed up, did the work, and came home smelling like antiseptic and coffee. I learned everything I know about patients from watching her fold herself smaller so other people could feel larger. When I got a full scholarship to Ohio State for biochemistry, she cried at the kitchen table. When I got into Northwestern's PhD program 4 years later, she called her sister in Columbus and talked for 2 hours. When I met my husband at a conference in Chicago, he was presenting a panel on pharmaceutical investment. I was presenting research on protein folding mechanisms. She asked me 3 times if I was sure about him. Not because she didn't like him. Because she could already see what I was walking into. His family was old Boston money, not the kind that got there recently through tech or finance, but the kind that had been there long enough to have a building named after them at a hospital they'd funded before either of us was born. His father had spent 30 years as a venture capitalist, specifically in biotech. He had opinions about the field, about the industry, about women in the field, about women in general. None of those opinions were stated directly. They were expressed through the slight pause before he answered my questions at dinner, through the way he addressed my husband when I was the one who had just spoken, through the smile he used at my own baby shower to turn a room of 200 people into an audience for his casual contempt. My husband and I had been married for 2 years when I filed the patent. We'd been together for 4. In that time, I had watched my father-in-law take every opportunity to position me as an accessory to his son's life rather than a person with my own trajectory. He was never cruel in a way that left evidence. He was the kind of man who understood that the most effective diminishment is the kind that makes the target look oversensitive if they object. At Thanksgiving during our first year of marriage, he described my research to a family friend as something to do while they're getting settled. At Christmas, he introduced me to a colleague as the one keeping my son fed while he builds something real. My husband corrected him both times. His father laughed both times, as if it were a charming misunderstanding rather than a pattern. I didn't argue. I documented. The research itself had started 4 years earlier, during the second year of my PhD. I was studying a class of proteins involved in inflammatory response, specifically how certain mutations affected their behavior in patients with autoimmune conditions. The work was quiet, methodical, and completely unglamorous. There were no headlines in it, no dramatic breakthroughs, just years of controlled experiments and careful documentation. My advisor, Dr. Simmons, used to say that real science looks like paperwork until suddenly it doesn't. He was right. The year I finished my postdoc, something clicked. I found a consistent mechanism, a way to modulate the protein behavior without triggering the cascade of side effects that had killed 3 previous drug candidates in clinical trials. I documented everything. I filed for provisional patent protection immediately before I said a word to anyone outside the lab. My husband was the second person I told. His father was not in the top 10. 2 months later, a mid-sized biotech firm out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, reached out through my university's tech transfer office. They wanted to license the mechanism. Negotiations went on for almost a year. The term sheet was finalized in March. The licensing deal was worth $4.2 million up front, with milestone payments that could reach $40 million if the drug made it through trials. The royalty structure was another conversation entirely. I didn't tell my in-laws. My husband agreed it wasn't relevant until everything was signed. His family had a habit of treating any information about our lives as an opportunity to offer direction. The baby shower was my mother-in-law's idea. She was not an unkind woman. She operated in the space between her husband's certainty and her children's needs, smoothing edges, deflecting attention, keeping peace. She planned the event with genuine warmth and very little awareness of how her husband would behave in a room where he felt like a host. The venue was a hotel ballroom in Brookline. White flowers, catered lunch, a photographer circling the room. Most of the guests were from his side of the family and his professional network. My mother flew in from Dayton the night before and sat beside me all afternoon looking like a woman trying to memorize every detail in case she needed it later. My father-in-law gave a toast. That was when he said it. He raised his glass, smiled at the room, and said that it was wonderful to see his son taking on the next chapter, and that he was confident the baby would have his father's instincts and his grandfather's drive. Then he looked at me with the particular warmth of someone who believes their condescension reads as affection, and he said, "And of course, we're grateful for our sweet Renata. Keeping everything running at home while the real work gets done. She's always been very good at supporting the people who matter." He paused, waiting for the laugh. He got it. My mother's hand found my arm under the table. My husband's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Across the room, my colleague, Dr. Adeyes Obi, who had flown in from Philadelphia specifically for this, met my eyes over the rim of her champagne glass. She raised an eyebrow a fraction of an inch. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. I had known this moment was coming. Not the specific words, but the shape of them. My father-in-law had been building towards some version of this for 4 years, and I had decided before the shower that I would let him finish building before I said a word. There was a reason I had invited Dr. Obi. There was a reason my university's communications director had sent me a message that morning confirming the publication timeline. There was a reason I had printed a document the night before, sealed it in an envelope, and given it to my husband with instructions to open it only if I gave him a signal. The NEGEM piece was going live in 2 days. The licensing deal was already announced in the biotech press. Quietly, but anyone who paid attention to pharmaceutical IP had seen it. What hadn't been widely covered was the name behind the mechanism. That was about to change. I had spent 3 years making sure the credit would be undeniable when it arrived. Every version of the research was time-stamped in my university's repository. Every communication about the licensing deal referenced my name, my patent, my work. Dr. Obi had been part of the peer review process. She had seen every draft. She knew exactly whose name had been attached to this from the beginning. After the toast, after the laughter settled, I watched my father-in-law work the room. He moved through the tables with the ease of someone who had spent decades understanding that presence is its own form of power. He shook hands with people he recognized from his investment network. He told stories. He accepted compliments. He was, by any observable measure, the most important person in the room. He didn't notice that 3 of the people he spoke to were pharmaceutical researchers who had recognized my name from the tech press. He didn't notice that Dr. True has... Obi had spent 20 minutes having a quiet conversation with my mother near the window, the 2 of them talking with the comfortable directness of women who have learned to read rooms accurately. He didn't notice my husband step outside briefly or the expression on my husband's face when he came back in. The afternoon moved slowly. There were games and gifts and the careful management of group photographs. I smiled at everything. My father-in-law's comment sat in the room like smoke, present in the air, unacknowledged, unaddressed. I could feel people choosing not to reference it. That was its own kind of data. Near the end of the event, when the catering staff had started clearing the dessert plates and small groups were beginning to gather their things, Dr. Obi walked to the front of the room and asked for everyone's attention. The room quieted. "I want to say something before we leave," she said, "because I've known Renata for 6 years, and I think this room should know who they've been celebrating today." My father-in-law looked up from a conversation near the bar. His expression was polite, slightly impatient. Dr. M.V. Bate. Obi spoke for 4 minutes. She described the mechanism I'd identified, in terms specific enough that anyone in the room with a biotech background would understand the significance. She described the licensing deal. She named the figure. She mentioned a NEGEM piece, the publication date, the fact that my name is the sole inventor listed on the patent. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She simply laid out the record, clearly and completely in the same tone she'd used presenting at a conference. The room was not entirely quiet by the end. I heard the specific silence of people recalibrating. The small shifts in posture, the glances exchanged, the sound of someone setting a glass down more carefully than they needed to. My father-in-law had stopped talking. He stood near the bar with his champagne in his hand, and he was looking at me, and I watched the particular expression move across his face that happens when someone who has been certain for a very long time encounters evidence that their certainty was wrong. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. My mother was watching him from across the room. She had the expression of a woman who had waited a long time to see something specific and was now watching it happen exactly as expected. My husband stood next to me and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had known this was coming. He had helped me carry it carefully for months, making sure I never showed my hand before I was ready, deflecting his father's comments without confirming or denying anything, holding the space while I worked. That was his version of support. Practical and steady, and it had cost him something to do it quietly. I hadn't forgotten that. After the guests left, after the room had emptied down to family and close friends, my father-in-law came to find me. He didn't apologize, not directly. He was not a man who moved easily through that kind of language. What he said was, I wasn't aware of the full picture. He said it quietly, without the performance that usually surrounded his statements. I looked at him for a moment before I answered. I know, I said. You never asked. He nodded once, slowly, and didn't respond. He picked up his coat from the chair beside him and went to say goodbye to his wife. I watched him cross the room. He looked like a man who had misread a map for years and had just been shown the actual terrain. That wasn't the end of it, not really. These things don't resolve in a single afternoon. But something shifted after that day, something structural rather than superficial. He started asking me questions at family dinners. Not many, and not always the right questions, but questions, actual curiosity rather than performance. He started addressing comments about our professional lives to me as well as to my husband. Small adjustments, barely visible, but they were there. 6 months after the baby shower, the licensing milestone was hit. The drug had passed phase 1 trials without incident. My university sent a press release. My father-in-law called to congratulate me. He said the words carefully, like a man who had recently learned them and was still deciding if they fit in his mouth. I thanked him. I meant it. My daughter was born in November. She was 7 pounds 4 ounces, and she made a sound when they put her in my arms that I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe accurately. My husband cried. My mother sat in the corner of the delivery room and held her rosary without praying, just holding it like an anchor. My father-in-law came to the hospital the next morning. He held his granddaughter for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Something unguarded, something that had put down its armor. She looks like you, he said. I didn't say anything. I just watched him hold her. This man who had spent 4 years cataloging my limitations, now holding the child I had grown while also building something that would outlast both of us. There was no victory in watching him. There was something quieter than that, harder to name. The particular peace that comes not from being proven right, but from no longer needing the proof. My mother flew home a week later. Before she left, we sat together in the kitchen at 4 in the morning while the baby slept, and she held her coffee cup in both hands the way she does when she's thinking. You handled it well, she said. I told her I'd learned from watching her. She looked at me for a moment and then shook her head very slightly. I didn't handle it. I survived it. There's a difference. She set her cup down and put her hand over mine. You did something different. You built something they couldn't ignore, and then you waited until the right moment. That's not the same as what I did. I didn't argue with her. She was right. There's a photograph on my desk now. It was taken at the shower just before everything shifted. My father-in-law mid-laugh, glass raised, and me in the corner of the frame with my hands folded in my lap and an expression on my face that reads, to anyone who doesn't know me, as patience. My husband has looked at that photograph a dozen times, and each time he says the same thing. You already knew, didn't you? Yes. I already knew. There's something they don't teach you in any PhD program, any patent seminar, any negotiation training. They don't teach you how to carry a truth quietly when someone else is busy announcing the wrong story. They don't teach you the discipline required to let a person finish being wrong before you correct the record. They don't teach you how to measure the exact right moment. Not too early, where it looks defensive, not too late, where it looks like accommodation. You learn that from watching a woman who worked double shifts and folded herself smaller so other people could feel larger, and who never once let that smallness become her permanent shape. I am my mother's daughter, in all the ways that matter and none of the ways that cost her. That's the only inheritance worth having. I've thought about that baby shower more times than I can count. Not the flowers, not the food, not even the moment A Daisy stood up and laid out the record in front of everyone. What I keep coming back to is the look on my father-in-law's face in the 2 seconds before he understood. That particular stillness. The moment when a person realizes the story they'd been telling doesn't match the one everyone else is about to hear. He wasn't a bad man. I want to be clear about that, because the easiest version of this story is the one where he's a villain, and I'm the hero, and everything resolves cleanly. That's not what happened. What happened is that he was a man who had moved through the world in one direction for 60-something years, and that direction had never required him to reconsider me. He filled in the blank where I was supposed to be with whatever was convenient, and no one had ever shown him otherwise. That's not cruelty. That's a kind of blindness that feels indistinguishable from cruelty when you're on the receiving end of it. The thing about carrying a truth quietly is that it requires a specific kind of discipline, not patience in the passive sense, not just waiting and hoping. Active, deliberate discipline. Every time he made one of his comments at dinner, I had a choice. I could correct him in the moment, which would have felt good for about 30 seconds and accomplished nothing structural. Or I could keep building, keep documenting, keep making the record undeniable, and wait until the moment the correction couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I chose the second thing. Every time. It cost something. I won't pretend it didn't. My mother taught me that without ever teaching it directly. I watched her absorb dismissal after dismissal over 30 years of nursing, watching less qualified people move past her because they were louder or better connected or simply more comfortable occupying space. She survived it through stillness. What she showed me, without meaning to, was the difference between enduring something and strategically outlasting it. She endured. I decided to do something different with what she'd shown me. What I understand now, looking back at Renata's story, my story, is that the outcomes people mistake for luck are almost always the result of work that wasn't visible to the people who didn't bother to look. My father-in-law didn't see the lab hours, the grant applications, the revisions, the provisional filings, the year of licensing negotiations. He saw a young woman at his son's side and filled in the rest himself. That gap between what he assumed and what was actually true, that gap was the entire thing. I didn't manufacture it, I just let it exist, quietly, until the right moment. There's nothing noble about suffering in silence for its own sake. Endurance without direction is just pain. What made the difference was that I was building while I waited. Every day I showed up to the lab was a day the gap between his assumptions and reality grew wider. The correction, when it finally came, wasn't something I performed. It was something I'd already earned, and Daisy simply read it aloud. My daughter is 8 months old now. She doesn't know any of this yet. Someday I'll tell her. Not the dramatic version with the baby shower and the silence and the $40 million figure. The quieter version. The one about her grandmother folding herself smaller so other people could feel larger, and what I decided to do with that inheritance. The one about how the most reliable form of power isn't the kind you announce, but the kind that's already built before anyone thinks to question it. That's the only version of the story worth passing on.